Fantastic. We're all good? Everybody happy? It truly is a great honor and a privilege for me to be up here today. And I felt so stirred during that moment in worship earlier where I just heard little pieces of your guys' heart saying what you are so grateful and thankful for what God is doing in your lives. It was truly an amazing moment. In fact, you may not know that at our Connect area there we also have cards that are prayer requests or Thanksgiving testimonies that you can fill in and let us know. And we'd love to hear them. If you've got prayer requests, we'd love to pray with you. So do make use of that area. It's just great to know that there's so much on your guys' hearts. All right. Is everybody good? We're ready to go. As you may or may not know, we're in a series called the David Dialogues, where we've been looking at communication and relationship lessons that we can pick up from David's life through various relationships that he has gone through. And right in the beginning of the series, Glenn actually introduced us to a concept called a crucial conversation. And some of you might know what that is. You're having a pretty casual conversation with someone, and suddenly, almost out of nowhere, it just escalates sky high. And Glenn told us that there are three main components of a casual conversation turning into a crucial conversation. And here they are. First of all, there are differing opinions. Second of all, there are escalating emotions. And third of all, the stakes are high. So some of you are thinking about that in your own life right now. In fact, I don't know if anyone here is still a fan of the series Friends. I still love it so much and watch it all the time. And the other day I was watching an episode that featured Ross getting into a pretty heated conversation with a colleague. So I thought for fun, let's have a look at this and see what we can do.
May I have a word with you?
Oh, of course, Donald.
We've been getting reports of some very angry behavior on your part.
What?
Threatening letters, a refusal to meet deadlines. Apparently, people now call you mental.
Yeah.
We want you to speak to a psychiatrist.
Oh, no. You don't understand. Ugh, this is so silly. This is all just because of a sandwich.
A sandwich?
Yeah, you see, my sister makes these amazing turkey sandwiches. Her secret is she puts an extra slice of gravy-soaked bread in the middle. I call it the moist maker. Anyway, I put my sandwich in the fridge over here. And
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I believe I ate that.
you ate my sandwich?
It was a simple mistake. It could happen to anyone.
Oh, really? Did you confuse it with your own turkey sandwich with a moist maker?
No.
Do you perhaps remember seeing a note on top of it?
There may have been a joke or limerick of some kind.
That said, it was my sandwich.
Now calm down. Come look in my office. Some of it may still be in the trash.
What?
Well, it was quite large. I had to throw most of it away.
You threw my sandwich away. My sandwich! My sandwich!
For us. And that escalated quite quickly over something fairly simple, I guess. And that seems to happen quite frequently to those guys. In the passage that we're going to look at today, in David's life, we see David right in the middle of a very crucial conversation of his own. Incidentally, it also revolves around a sandwich of sorts. You'll see why when we get there. This may not be the most well-known story in David's life, but it actually is one of the most exciting stories in David's life, and it had the potential to go drastically wrong for David. So just to give you a little bit of a heads up, we find David here in the story in the years where he and his men are actually fugitives from King Saul. Saul's forces are repeatedly pursuing David, but he continues to successfully elude them. And on this specific occasion, David is in the wilderness of Paran, which is basically just a very vast area, a good environment for raising sheep and goats. Basically, you can think of it as the Karoo. That's pretty much where he was. And in this specific area, we find a very wealthy man. His name is Nabal, and he uses this land for his very large flocks. Now, Nabal is described as a churlish man. I don't know if any of you have heard the word churlish before, but I looked it up for us, and it means difficult, cruel, harsh, inflexible, and stubborn. So I don't know who was here last week, but I was trying to rack my brain back. Lorelei and Vaughan were preaching, and then Lorelei was trying to describe Vaughan to us, and I think that's what she was trying to say, if I remember correctly. Difficult, cruel, harsh, inflexible, and stubborn is very much how we find Vaughan around the office. So churlish is the word that we can use there for Vaughan. That's obviously a joke. Let's read the text, and then we can see exactly what's going on. So it's 1 Samuel 25, starting at verse 1. It says, Then David rose and went to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. This man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The name of this man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to these young men, Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him, Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at your hand to your servants and to your son David. Now when David's men came, they went and they said all of this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. So should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? So David's men turned away and came back and told him all of this. And David said to his men, Every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So here we see a conversation that is happening between Nabal and David, but which was not even face to face. It was via messengers. And perhaps back in those days, it was almost like the WhatsApp of how to communicate. It was done via a messenger. And so David was not face to face with him, but it went from something that was seemingly casual, just asking for some food for his men, and it escalated really quickly into a crucial conversation. Opinions differed, emotions definitely skyrocketed, and suddenly the stakes were very high. I think that there are two significant things that come out of the story that we're going to look at today. The first one is that the shalom of David is met with the scorn of Nabal. And the second thing is the sword of David is met with the shalom of Abigail. And we'll look at Abigail's part in this a little bit later. So when preparing this message this week, we've got a great system on our team, and we input with each other and get bits and pieces and feedback and input. And Duncan, who many of you know, who was leading worship this morning, who is one of my best friends, said to me, if you don't name your sermon the Shalom Sandwich, the friendship's going to be over. And so I thought I value that friendship, so I'm going to go with it. So today's title is the Shalom Sandwich. And as we get into it, you'll find out more as we go. So the first part of today that we're going to look at is the Shalom of David. In verse 6 that we just read, this blessing, it says, the peace of God to Nabal and the peace of God be over you, your entire household, your wife, your children, your men servants, your female servants, even all your livestock. And this peace that David is offering over here is actually a Hebrew word, shalom. Some of you might know the word. Shalom is a word that not only implies a lack of conflict, but it even implies completeness, soundness, welfare, and most importantly, peace. It was actually a very common and a very respectful blessing and greeting of peace that David was given. In fact, in ancient church times even, there was a common greeting that would happen. So the minister would come up in front of the church on a Sunday, and he would say, the peace of the Lord be always with you. And then the congregation would reply, yes. Glenn and Vaughan knew that because they're so old, they were around in the ancient church times. But I think it's quite cool. So let's do it together. So I'll say it. The peace of the Lord be always with you, and then you reply. Yeah, it's quite nice, actually. Maybe it's something we can bring into the modern church times from the ancient church times. But basically what it meant is that before any gathered time of worship like this could continue, everyone that came had to deal with any conflict, any unresolved issues of hurt, or any sinful actions, whether intentional or non-intentional, by confessing, by seeking forgiveness, or even by giving forgiveness, so that this peace, this very shalom of God, would reign and be present amongst all the worshippers. And so that is actually quite a beautiful thing. In this text, David is not only extending the blessing of peace to Nabal, he's also declaring something. He's declaring that there is no sin and no wrongdoing between his men and Nabal's servants. He's saying that there is soundness, there is welfare, and there is peace between them. I wonder, for us today, what would our response be? Imagine if you went to someone with your own protective peace over them, or you came with your blessing of shalom to somebody, and it was just met with scorn and contempt in the same way that Nabal's response was. How would you feel if you came with a declaration of welfare or a declaration of peace to somebody, and it was just met with a cruel insult? In fact, maybe you can think of times in your life that has actually happened. Well, Nabal's response was not a great response. He said, "Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse?" And it really is a scoffing question coming from Nabal, and it provides an immediate insult. Because let's be honest, who wouldn't know about this hero? It was just a few years before that he had brought victory to the whole of Israel by defeating Goliath, and we heard about that in the series. How could Nabal even pretend not to know of the one of whom the woman sang his praises, as we read about in 1 Samuel 18? This is such a slap in the face to the messengers and to their leader. Nabal's harsh dismissal of David's simple request for food really just demonstrates his true nature. And truly, from the overflow of Nabal's heart, his mouth spoke. The truth for us is that is exactly how mankind treated Jesus. The Prince of Peace himself came to extend God's shalom, God's peace to all of humanity, and we met him with selfish scorn and contempt in the same way. The response of man was, "Who is this Jesus? Who is the son of Joseph? A carpenter from Nazareth? What good could come from Nazareth?" And you see, Jesus came to us with the free offer of the greatest protective peace that we could have ever hoped for. And even in the face of complete opposition, Jesus still brought his shalom to you and to me. And it's true even today, right now, right here in this venue. You know, Jesus is here. And he's offering you and I this greatest shalom, this greatest peace that we could hope for. And I wonder this morning, what will our response be to Jesus offering his peace to you and me? It's at this exact point when the conversation between Nabal and David actually became crucial. And crucial conversations often only become crucial when one party is casually discussing something that seemingly is just casual, and he thinks he's discussing it in peace. And the other party, out of nowhere, suddenly takes offense, or he hears and reacts with scorn and contempt. I wonder what was in Nabal's heart that caused him to respond this way. Looking at it, I think the scorn and contempt to David's request is grounded in two things. The first thing that it is grounded in is his own arrogance. And the second thing that it is grounded in is his foolish selfishness. Basically, Nabal was like a selfish child, and he's not going to share. And especially not with someone that he's got no respect for, because he just sees David as a mere slave. In verse 10 and 11, we read Nabal saying, "Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I don't even know where?" And we really see his selfishness shown in the repetitive "my" statements. I was reminded of my niece, who's 12 now, I think, and when she was just learning how to talk, she has an Afrikaans mom, and she would say "myne" Maina, that was one of her first words, which means mine. And we used to joke with her and call her Maina because she would say it so often. And it's really like this. This is Nabal just being like a selfish child, thinking that everything belongs to him. It also reminds me a little bit of the man in Jesus' parable of the rich fool. We read about it in Luke chapter 12, which says, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I've got nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grains and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And God said to him, you fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. A question for us this morning is, aren't we just so often like that? Aren't we like Nabal in so many ways? Why are we so foolish with our stuff? Why do we actually think that it's ours and ours alone in the first place? Why do we live foolishly and selfishly and not share? At any rate, it's at this point that we see that David has now had enough. He's not going to take this kind of disrespectful rejection any longer. And unfortunately, he reacts in anger. The pity is that David has had, up until now, such a great track record of responding well. But now, all of a sudden, he reacts in anger. I was wondering, why would he risk so much? It's just some farmer in the Karoo. It wasn't even anyone important. It wasn't even such a big battle for David, but David decided to make it one. Why would you want to lose everything on something so small? And it's interesting because it's something we still see today in and amongst our own lives. You know, somebody can have a spotless track record in their life or in their career or in whatever, and then in one silly moment or in one foolish tweet, everything can implode around them. And that is what was potentially about to happen here to David. Looking at the text, it's also worth noting that there is a very physical aspect, purely physical as to what's going on. You may have noticed it, but David was asking for food. So it's obvious that he and his men must have been hungry, right? Now, I don't know how many of you know about this term, hangry. You may have heard it. It's a very real thing. It's when you are so hungry that you actually start getting angry. Can anybody identify? Yeah, oh, cool, lots of people. Well, those of you who know me well enough will know that my mood is generally quite consistent, I think. But there does come that point in the day where you know you just need to eat. And if you progress past that point of where you needed to eat, suddenly the whole office knows about it because hangry has set in. And in our office, everybody runs for their lives because Simon is coming to find whatever lunch he can get his hands on. And that's just the truth of the situation. Sometimes things that wouldn't ordinarily escalate so quickly, they do so, but it's just because of something purely physical like hunger or you need some rest or something physical. And so it's something to take note of and think about in your dialogues with other people. And it's something that you should check on before allowing things to escalate out of control. Whatever the reason was for David, I don't know if it was he was hangry or not, but he declares something very significant here in verse 13, and this is where things change. He says in verse 13, every man strap on his sword. And it's got an exclamation point after that. And that punctuation mark, the exclamation mark, is an imperative, which means that from David, it was a direct order. Sadly, David probably didn't even realize at the time, but this is a moment in his life that could have ended up being his greatest setback. It possibly could have even been a moment that he would never have recovered from if he had allowed that to happen. In our dialogue with each other, we need to be very conscious of our punctuation marks when we speak, especially imperatives, because when we use exclamation marks in the way that we speak to each other, we actually leave no room for discussion or healthy discourse. Basically, an exclamation mark is like the equivalent of a destructive shouting match between two people. It shuts down dialogue. It cuts off any real chance of seeing other possibilities or other solutions. That person has thrown down the gauntlet of imperative. What we also see here, and it's worth noting, is that David is unconsciously modeling or discipling those around him as he declares this line, strap on your swords. And it's something in our lives and in our relationships when we immediately react to something instead of responding well, when we're in our own lives so fast to strap on the sword in a conversation with someone. And that's when we get into these crucial conversations. And we need to remember that what we are doing unconsciously is we're modeling that behavior. We're discipling those around us with this type of behavior. And it's especially true of our children who are watching every move that we make. But unfortunately, David sees no other alternative here but to destroy Nabal and to destroy everything that belongs to him. David's vow is now one of blood guilt towards another Israelite. And it was into this explosive situation that Abigail enters. And that takes us into the second part of what we're talking about today, and that is Abigail's shalom. We're going to read it now, but just to get us into it, basically what happens is one of Nabal's men goes to Abigail, the wife of Nabal, and she tells Abigail about David's request and how Nabal had reacted. He told her how good David and his men had been to them, but now David was angered and he was coming to destroy them. So Abigail needs to decide what to do now in this situation. And we can pick up on the story in verse 18. Then Abigail made haste, and she took a whole lot of food. She took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and she laid them all on the donkeys. She said to her men, "Go on before me, behold, I'll come after you." And she did not tell her husband, Nabal. As she rode on the donkey, she came under the cover of a mountain. David and his men came towards her, and she met them. Now David said, "Surely in vain I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed, and all that belonged to him, and it was returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey, and she fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said this amazing speech. She said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. And then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live." I believe here we've got so much that we can actually learn from Abigail in this story. What a remarkable woman, right? It's just incredible. And I think that there are 2 stances that Abigail takes in her dialogue from David that we can really learn from. The first thing is she chooses wisdom. It says here that as soon as Abigail hears about this potentially explosive situation, she makes haste. She doesn't sit back and arrogantly wait for David to arrive on her driveway. She goes and she meets him immediately on his turf. I believe that Abigail is really drawing on the wisdom that God had actually been building into her life for many years as she was married to this churlish man. I believe that's true for us. I think that God, for years, builds wisdom into us. You know, the Proverbs say time and time again, ask the Lord for wisdom. It's something that you can ask God for. And I believe that through years, God builds wisdom into our life. And Abigail, what an amazing example of someone who drew on that wisdom that God had built into her in this situation. The second thing that she chooses is Abigail chooses humility. 1 Peter 5:5 tells us, "Clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. For God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And here we see a woman who really remained in humility before her enemies, even before someone who had the power that David could have destroyed her family, her servants, her home, her whole life could have been destroyed. And she really could have shown a way different attitude towards David. But through one of her greatest strengths, humility, she actually saved her entire household. And Abigail's example here points to the importance of the words that we choose when we speak in these tense situations. Harsh, loud words may become the catalyst to an unnecessary explosion. They could drive individuals to actions that would be regretted later. But in contrast, as Abigail shows us here, we can see how calm, carefully chosen words can lead to a very peaceful parting and a better solution. Proverbs 15 verse 1, it's a really well-known one. It says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." So first Abigail falls on her face before David, and she says to him, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt." And what this shows us is that she took complete responsibility for these cruel decisions and the actions of her husband. She also postured herself as a servant to David. In this speech of hers, she called David my Lord 14 times and addressed herself 6 times as his servant. This is a very intentional move, I believe, from Abigail, because it gives her enough time to calm David's anger and shift the conversation to other possible solutions. At the end of the day, it really was her humility that silenced her enemy, and she beautifully manages to move David from his violent reaction to a much more level-headed response. A lesson here for us is always choose to respond rather than to react. We see that David even apologizes to Abigail after that and thanks her for her words that restrained him from killing many innocent people in his anger. These words of Abigail are amazing because they literally return the blessing, the shalom, back to David. This shalom literally covers over him and protects him from sin and protects him what could have been his greatest setback in his life. I wonder if there have been times in your life where you have done the same, where you have used words of humility or words of gentleness that have really saved something from becoming a disastrous situation. I think that when we find ourselves in these crucial conversations, and we will find ourselves in them, a response that is covered in wisdom, that is covered in humility, and that is covered in gentleness will yield a much more desirable outcome compared to words of anger, words of harshness, or words of bitterness, which have the potential to lead to a much more disastrous outcome. A humble position truly is a powerful position, and an ultimate example of that is Jesus himself. Philippians 2:8 says that being found in human form, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. As we wrap up the story and the way that David had to deal with things, I wonder who you identify with mostly in the story. Maybe you identify with one of these characters. Maybe somehow you're identifying with all 3 of them. Do you identify with Nabal, perhaps, who acted in arrogance and foolish selfishness? You see, what happened is, like the man in the parable, God also took Nabal's life shortly after this. And of course, Nabal left and could take nothing with him. Do you find yourself similar to Nabal this morning? Acting in selfishness, holding on to what God has given you, not sharing with those around you, and living a life purely for yourself. Like Nabal and the man in that parable, you'll go one day, and you won't take any of that with you. Perhaps you identify with David himself. Maybe this morning, as you look at the story and how David reacted, you find that you yourself are strapping on this sword far too quickly. Maybe in your relationships and in your life, you're finding that you're strapping on your sword, you're using that exclamation mark to those around you, and you're doing that far too quickly. Perhaps you're actually finding yourself becoming dangerously close to losing everything in a moment of anger. And this morning, church, that is not what God wants for your life. God wants you to think before you react how you're going to respond. Because in a foolish moment, everything could implode around you just in the way that you react. Perhaps you're identifying with Abigail in the story, this remarkable woman. You know, in 2 Corinthians 5, we read about the ministry of reconciliation. And in verse 20 of that chapter, it says that we are ambassadors for Christ. And Abigail truly was that. She was an ambassador. Today, even this morning, we're all called to be ministers of reconciliation. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what Jesus was to us. Jesus reconciled us. If you think about it, Jesus, of all people, had every right to strap on that sword towards humanity. He had every right to. We did nothing to deserve what Jesus came and gave us. And he had the right to come and destroy us in one foul swoop, but he didn't. As we see here, Jesus humbled himself. He became obedient to the point of death, even a cruel death on a cross. And this morning, today, right here, we have access to that peace. We have access to that shalom that Jesus himself came to give us. The question is, what will we do with that as Jesus offers us that this morning? Shall we pray? Jesus, we're so grateful as we stand before you this morning. We're so grateful for what you brought to humankind and to each of us individually. I thank you this morning for your shalom, Jesus, for your peace that covers over us. And we ask for that this morning, Father God. As we think about the cross, as we look towards what you accomplished for us, Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace that we murdered. Lord, I pray, settle into our hearts that shalom, the peace, that we might receive it in your name this morning, God. Amen.